Hey, I'm Hunter from SkillThrive, and in this video, we're going to learn how to create this really cool button emoji project. Now, this might seem like a little bit of a random project, but I actually had to come across this in a side project I'm working on. I thought it'd be fun to share with you on how I came to actually solve this, solve on how to do this in React. Now, there's still going to be a lot that we're going to be covering in this. We're going to learn how to use emojis properly so they're accessible. We're going to learn about style components and how to create animations in style components, which is going to allow us to pass in custom props so we can create random animations. Anytime we click this button, each one is going to be different. And we're also going to be learning about how to remove an element from the DOM by writing a custom auto expire component, which after 6 seconds removes an element from the DOM. So it sounds like a lot, but it's really not that much. So let's go ahead and dive in and get started. So the first thing I want to do is I want to come to codesandbox.io, and once you sign up for a free account, go ahead and click on New Sandbox, and then under My Recently Used, I see React, but you'll also see under Official Templates, you can click here on React, and if it's still not there, you can come over and just filter here and type in React, and then click on this button to create a new React project. All right, so now that this is in my drafts, the first thing I want to do is I just want to go ahead and just change some of the default code that it spit out here for me. And the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and get rid of this styles.css file. I want to get rid of these headers. And I also want to get rid of the CSS file here. So yes, I want to delete this. All right, so now that we have that, let's go ahead and create a new folder here in our source directory. So we'll go ahead and call this one components. And I'm also going to create a new folder here called emoji. Let's make sure we capitalize that. And now what we can do is we want to go ahead and install the dependencies that we need in this project. Now there's only one extra dependency that we need, and that is styled components. Now, if you've developed something on your local machine, you know that you can install components through npm on your command line, but it's a little different in Code Sandbox. And the way we add dependencies is by clicking here on this Add Dependency button and then searching for the component, or excuse me, the package that we want. So that's going to be style components. So we'll click here, and if we come into our package.json, you'll see under dependencies, we now have styled components. All right, so now that we have styled components created, the next thing we want to do is we want to create an emoji wrapper component. So in order to do that, I want to come into our components emoji folder here, click on this to create a new file, and I'm going to create a emoji wrapper.jsx file. So let's go ahead and create that. And at the top, I'm going to import React from React. And I'm going to create a new component here called emoji wrapper. And we could just pass in the props like this, but I'm just going to go ahead and destructure the names of the props that I need. So that's going to be class name, symbol, and label. And go ahead and write our arrow function. And then here we want to return a span. Now, what the point of this component is that this is going to be the span that wraps the individual emojis and makes sure that they're accessible. So let's go ahead now, and because this is an image, we need to define a role for this span, which is going to be image. Next up, we want to say aria label is equal to the label prop that we passed in. So I'm going to write a ternary operator here that says, hey, is label passed in? If so, go ahead and use it. And if not, the default is just going to be an empty string. Next up is aria hidden. So this is again going to be a ternary operator that's going to say, hey, is label passed in? If so, set it to false. And if not, set it to true. Okay, and then next up we want to set our class name, and that's going to be equal to the class name that we passed in from the prop. And we need to make sure we go ahead and close this span out and go ahead and do the closing span tag. And in between here is where we're going to render the symbol, which is going to be the emoji. So let's go ahead and do that here, symbol. And the last thing we need to do is export this. So export default emoji wrapper. Cool. So let's go ahead and then save that. And we should be good here. So let's go ahead and close this out. And let's see what we have to do next. All right, so the next thing we need to do is create the emoji component. So again, I'm going to come into this folder, click here to create a new file, and do emoji.jsx. And in here, what we're going to do is import styled from styled components. And I'm going to go over what this is. So let's do styled from styled components. I'm also going to import that wrapper that we just created. So emoji wrapper. And that's going to be from the same folder, emoji wrapper. All right, so the way we can create a styled component is first naming the constant. So this is going to be called emoji equals styled. Now, usually what you could do is just pass in an HTML element like a span tag or a div or anything like that, and then 2 backticks. And in between here, you can just write your CSS. And that div is going to have the CSS. And then you can wrap, other, children components with this emoji component, and it's going to pass those styles on. But instead of using an HTML element, you can also use a component, which is the emoji wrapper that we just passed in. So in order to do that, we write the parentheses and then the component name, which is the emoji wrapper. Then here we do the backticks again. And here we just write our standard CSS, just like we would if we were just doing this in, plain old HTML and CSS. So we do font size. Now here's where things get different. We can pass in something called props. So let's do props. And we can pass in these props from the component, which you'll see in just a few minutes. And what we want to do here is we want to write a ternary operator to see if props.size was passed in. If it was, we'll just go ahead and use props.size. And if not, we'll have a fallback of 1 rem. Now, just like we did with this emoji wrapper, when we were deconstructing the components, or excuse me, the props, we can do the same thing here. So instead of writing props.size, we can just say size. And just go ahead and get rid of props here, and then props here. And that's the same thing, just a little bit less code. So let's go ahead and save that. And now what we can do, or actually there's an error here. I need to make sure I wrap this with parentheses. There we go. And then you can do export default emoji. All right, so now we have our emoji component. Let's go ahead and save that. And the next thing we need to do is just go ahead and create the emoji board component, which is where most of our code and components are going to live. So let's come into our project here under this emoji folder and create a new file called emoji, let's call it emojiboard.jsx. Okay, so let's go ahead now, and what we want to do is go ahead and import a couple things. So let's go ahead and import React from React. And I'm looking at the final project here, and I have other things I'm importing, but I don't need those now. So we do need the emoji component because we do have that created. And that's going to be from the same file, emoji. And I think that's everything for now that we need to import. So let's go ahead and define this component. So const emoji board. And we'll just go ahead and do an arrow function. Feel free not to use an arrow function if you prefer. And let's go ahead and in the return, render out a emoji. So let's see here. In the return, I'll use that emoji component that we just created. And what I can do here is say label equals, we'll do thumbs up, and symbol will be equal to, now on a Mac I can do Control Command Spacebar to get this little window pop up. I can click here to select the emoji, and that needs to be in between some parentheses like that, or not parentheses, but quotes. And then we can pass in a size here as well. And I'll just do 3 rem. So go ahead and do this. And we need to make sure we export this. So export default emoji board. Now we're not going to see anything in this app yet because we haven't imported this emoji board into our app, which is where everything is being rendered. So let's head into our app here, and we want to import this at the top. So import emoji board from, go up to, actually no, same location, components, and then emoji / emoji board. Okay. And then here we just want to pass in that emoji board. So emoji board, close that component off, and then save it. And now we can see that emoji is rendering. And if we come in and right click and inspect, you'll see what that emoji wrapper is doing. So what it's doing is that it wrapped this little component here with the span of roll image, ARIA label of thumbs up, and ARIA hidden is false. So everything is working as expected, and this emoji is as accessible as possible. All right, so now that we have that, let's go ahead and create an emoji button component. So I'm gonna come back into this emoji folder here, create a new file called emoji button.jsx. And let's go to open up this project here. Okay, so at the top here, I'm going to import React because I'm actually going to be creating a component here as well. And let's go ahead and close off this console so we get some more space. So that's from React. And then we're also going to import styled from styled components. So it's going to do that. Okay. Now I'm going to go ahead and create a React div here called ARIA div. Now you could create this as a separate component like we did for the wrapper, but I'm just going to go ahead and define it here because this is the only place we're going to be using it. So what I'm going to do is say const ARIA div equals, go ahead and do our arrow function here. And then in here, I'm going to go ahead and destructure the props that we need here. So it's going to be class name, which is going to be passed in from styled components, children, on click, and then on key down. Now, don't worry so much about what these props are for now. We'll go ahead and cover those here in just a bit when we do our event handler functions. All right, so here we're going to return a div. And in this div, let's go ahead and just close this off. In between here, we want to go ahead and render the children. So what this is anything we wrap this component around, the children, which is going to be inside it, is just going to be rendered in between those two divs. So let's go ahead and just say children. And technically, this is already a component, so we can save it, and things are looking fine. Now, the reason we're creating this ARIA div is because we're creating a button, but we're not actually using an HTML button. So in order to make a div accessible and act like a button, we have to pass in some ARIA roles to make this accessible, so it actually functions like a button. So what I can do here is just like we did for the ARIA image, we'll set a role, but this time we're going to set a role to button. We'll say ARIA pressed. So we want this either to be pressed or not pressed. So by default, we'll say false. Next, we want tab index. And we can set tab index to 0, which is going to make sure that whatever is in the DOM is just going to be tabbable and also going to be tabbed in order to what its position is in the DOM. So tab index 0, class name is going to be the class name that we passed in. And on click is going to be equal to the same thing that we passed in. And on key down is going to be equal to on key down. So we're getting an error here because I have a capital O here. So let's make sure that's lowercase. So that goes away. All right, so let's go ahead and save that now. And cool. So we now have this ARIA div, which we can pass into our style component that we're about to define below. So we're going to call that style component emoji button. So const emoji button equals styled, passing in that component we just created. So ARIA div, and then the two backticks, and then in between here, we can create the CSS just like we would anywhere else. So we can set a padding. Let's set a padding to 3 rem. We'll set a margin to 1 rem. Background color we'll set to the following hex code. And let's see here. The next thing we want to do is set a width to fit content. We'll set a cursor to pointer. Next up, we want to set transition. And what I'm going to do is set this on the box shadow element. Now you could say transition all, but it's more performant if you target what you want to set that transition to. So let's do 0.3 seconds with an ease. Now what this is going to do is when we add this hover effect, once we hover over it, instead of it happening instantly, it's going to have this nice smooth transition effect, which is going to look a little bit nicer. Now the way we can add a hover effect to this emoji button is first by doing the ampersand, and then we can say hover, which means, hey, apply this to the current element and it's going to be hover. So if you use something like SAS or anything like that, this is going to feel familiar. And here we can set a box shadow. And I'm just going to copy this from the final project, and I'm just going to paste it here. And we need to make sure we export this emoji button. So let's do export default emoji button. And then we can go ahead and save that. And then we can go ahead and use that emoji button in our component. So let's go back into our emoji board here. At the top, we want to import our emoji button. So import emoji button from emoji button, okay? And this is going to be wrapped around this individual emoji. So first what we want to do is go ahead and wrap this. So emoji button, oops, not board, emoji button. Go ahead and give that closing emoji button. Go ahead and copy this, which is the child, which is going to be rendered in between. So we save that. Cool. Now you can see those styles applied to this emoji button. Now remember, we need to pass in some extra props here. And the first one we want to do is on click. We'll set that to a function here that we have not yet defined. We'll call this handle emoji click. Now we might get an error here just because we haven't defined this function, which is fine. All right, so we want to do that. And the next thing we want to do is we want to handle the on key down event as well. So on key down equals this here, we actually want to pass in the event so we can use the data that comes from it. And what we're going to be doing is looking to see if the key pressed was enter. And if it was, then we'll actually do something with this function. So that's going to be handle emoji key down. Remember, this is a function that we have not defined yet. And for now, we still need to pass in some things here. We'll go ahead and pass in the event because we have defined it. But we're also going to be passing in a label and a symbol, which we need to do in just a few seconds. All right, so right now we're having this label, symbol, and size. We're having this hard coded. And a better way is to define that object at the top and then use a map function to map over and put the data where it needs to go. So at the top here, I'm going to come in and create a new constant. Call this emoji. Actually, no, we need to do this inside the emoji board. So let's do an emoji board. Create a new const called just emojis. And we'll set this to an array of objects. And the first object here is going to have a label. And it's going to be thumbs up. And the symbol is going to be the thumbs up symbol. So it's going to paste that here. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and fast forward and create some other emojis here that we can then render to the DOM. So let's go ahead and just do that now. All right. So now that we have this constant defined with all the emojis we want to use in the project, we can come down here to the return and then map over that array in order to put those emojis in here. So in order to do that, the first thing I'm going to do is say emojis. So that's our array. And then use the map function. And here we can pass in the things that we need from that object. And we can also just go ahead and destructure that. So it's going to be the label and the symbol. Then our arrow function, and then we need to return some stuff in between here. So let's go ahead and copy or cut out this emoji button, paste it here. And we're getting an error right now because I think we need to wrap this around a div. Let's see here, and then a div, closing div. Okay, so right now we're getting those 4 emojis, but we're not mapping the data to them. So what we need to do here, instead of label, we can just pass in that label. And instead of symbol, we can pass in the symbol from that array of objects as well. Okay, so now we can see all 4 of those, or 5 of those emojis rendering to the DOM. Now remember I said we're going to pass in some other things here on this event. So let's go ahead and define those. So that's label and symbol. And here we pass in the event, and we're also going to pass in the label and symbol as well. Okay, so that looks like basically everything we want to do here. There's just one more thing I want to do, and that's create an emoji board wrapper, which is going to essentially just apply Flexbox to these divs. So let's go ahead now and create that emoji board wrapper. So in this folder, we're going to create a new file called emoji board wrapper.jsx. Here we're just going to use a styled component. So import styled from styled components. We'll create an emoji board wrapper. And this is going to be a styled div. So we're not passing in a component this time, just a standard HTML element. Okay, so we have that. Let's go ahead now and set display to flex and flex wrap to wrap. And this makes sure that once this gets to a specific length, the flex items will get pushed down to the next row. So we'll do that. We set it to flex wrap to wrap. And don't forget, we need to export this as well so we can use it in our other components. So export default emoji board wrapper. All right, so that's everything for that. Let's go ahead and save it and close this out. Come back into our emoji board, and at the top here in our imports, let's go ahead and import that at the top. So that's going to be emoji board wrapper from emoji board wrapper. Okay, so now that we have that, we can wrap these components that we just rendered here. So let's do emoji board wrapper. Go ahead and give the closing component as well. And we can just copy this entire map function that we just wrote, paste it, and then save it. Cool. And now we'll see that these are Flexbox components. All right. So that's just a little bit of extra styling there. And the next thing we want to do is we want to create a state to track which buttons are clicked. And what this is going to do is below this emoji buttons, we're going to create another map function, which is going to render out whatever is in that state. So in order to define that state, we're going to use useState from React. So let's go ahead and import that here at the top. So import useState from React. And we also need to go ahead and define that state at the top. So under these emojis that we just wrote, we'll say const, and we have to do this in an array with 2 variables. So const emoji q, and then the next one is what we call to change that state. And a good naming convention is call this something like emoji q and then set emoji q, or is open and then set is open. So that's a good naming convention to stick to, so things don't get too confusing. So let's do set emoji q, and that is going to be equal to useState, and we'll just pass an empty array here. Okay, so that's all we need to do in order to initialize the state. And now that we have this state initialized, we can go ahead and define these functions here. So we make sure that we're passing in that label and symbol into that array, and then it's rendered in the DOM. So let's go ahead now and define those functions right here. So we'll do that with a constant. So we'll say handle emoji click. And the next one we want to define is const handle emoji key down. All right, so what we want to do here on the emoji click, remember we're passing in that label and the symbol. So we need to go ahead and define those here. So this is what we're passing in from down here, so label and symbol. And then what we want to do is we want to set emoji q. Now remember, this is an array, so we don't want to mutate this array. So what we want to do is we want to get the current values of what's in the array and then add this to the array. And one way we can do that is using the spread syntax. So we'll do emoji q, whoops. So now we have access to the current array value, and then we can pass in a new object. And we'll go ahead and define that right here. And what we want to do on this object is first pass in the label that we originally called on the handle emoji click, and also the symbol. And the reason we're passing this in is because once we use the map function a little bit later below in order to render the little bubbles, we need all this information to handle everything correctly. Now, another thing we're going to do is we're going to set a size. We're going to set a left property, a 1, and a 2. And all of these are going to be used in the styled components, which we haven't yet written. And what this is going to allow us to do is pass in custom properties into those components, so we get different sizes, we get different animations, so everything looks really nice and organic without a lot of work in CSS. So what we want to do here is I want to generate random numbers. Now, generating random numbers is actually pretty simple in JavaScript, but I'm going to write some helper functions here in order to just make this a little bit easier. So the first thing is just go ahead and write a new function called random number. And we'll pass in two variables here, max and min. And the reason we're doing this is because we want a random number between two values. And let's go ahead and define that function here. And what we want to do is return math floor, where we get a math random number. We want to call that and then multiply it by max minus min plus 1. Now, I'm not going to explain all the math to you. I literally just Googled this on Stack Overflow and found a solution that worked. So, I'm not a genius here, just finding solutions on the internet. And cool, now we have a function that's going to create a random number when we pass in a max and min value. So now let's go ahead and handle when we want to return possibly negative or positive values. So this one, I'm going to do random pos or neg, so positive or negative. Again, this is going to take a max and min. And let's go ahead and define, this is going to be similar but a little bit different because we want to get that random number and then randomly define it as either negative or positive. So we'll do let random number equal, and it's the exact same function here. So we're getting a random number the same way as we did before. But now what we're doing is we're going to take that random number and we're going to multiply it by the value that we're about to get from this function. And what this function is going to do is it's going to return either -1 or 1 50% of the time. So it's completely random, and then it's going to multiply the number. So if the number is 5 and the number we get back from this is -1, the final number is going to be -5. So let's do this right here where we just write out this function. And we're going to say, hey, does this, from what we get from this, does that equal 1? If so, we'll just go ahead and multiply it by 1. And if not, we'll multiply it by -1. And then last, we need to make sure we're returning something from this. So we'll just go ahead and return a random number. Okay, so now that we have those two helper functions defined, we can go ahead and define those numbers here when we're setting that emoji to our state. So let's see here. So we passed in, so now we need to define the size. So let's do random number. And remember, this takes a max and min value. And because we're using rim units, I don't want them to be too crazy. So what I did is just a max of 3 and a max of 2. So essentially they're 3 or 2. Then the next one we want to define is a left. And this is just going to be the random number generator as well. And this is either going to be 100 or 0. And what this is going to do is it's either going to look at the page and it's going to move it left either 0, so all the way over to here, or 100%. And this is going to pick a random number from the left or right of the screen. And because we're going to move those emojis to the bottom, they're just going to start off at the bottom as well. But we'll define that later in our styled component. Then here on 1, we're going to use random number, positive or negative. And here we want 200 to be a max and 50. Now, again, once we write this style component for the animated emoji, what this is going to do is there's going to be 2 spots in the animation. It's going to be the first where it starts, the middle, so 50%, and then the top, 100%. And we're at 50%, we're going to have a value, and at 100%, we're going to have a value. And it's just going to animate from that those 2 spots. So this is what this number here, 1 and 2, are doing. So it's just the 2 points that we're going to define in our CSS animation. And again, this is a random positive or negative number. And this is going to be the same thing, 250. Now, I came up with these numbers just by playing around with them. I felt like they looked nice for my project, but feel free to play around and pick random numbers that you like. All right, so I know that's a lot here, and let's see what we need to do next. Okay, so next we need to handle this emoji key down. Now remember, we're passing in the event, the label, and the symbol. And this is essentially the same thing, but what we want to do is we want to say if the event.key equals enter. Now it's really important to make sure that enter is capitalized here, because that's how it's going to come back into the browser. And if it is, what we want to do is literally the same thing here. So let's just copy this and paste it in, and we can go ahead and save that. All right, so now what we can do is let's go ahead and make sure that this is working. And the way I can make sure that this is working is I can use effect, which handles side effects in React. And we'll be using this later on, but for now, I'm just going to be using it to track the queue and then console log the queue once it changes. So we'll do use effect, right? Our callback here. Second argument is the array of variables that we need to watch. Now, if it's empty, it's just going to run it once when the component mounts. And if we pass in variables here, it's going to watch to make sure to see if those change. And if they change, then it's going to run that function again. So what we want to watch is the emoji queue. So once that changes, we want to console.log the emoji queue. And if all those things went as expected, we should be seeing the this logged out to the console. Now I'm not sure what happened to the emojis. Cool, there we go. Check the render method of emoji board. So let me dig in to see if I can figure out what this is complaining about. So one thing I know it's going to complain about is whenever we map over something, we have to pass in a key. So let's see if passing in a key here, and we can go ahead and just pass in like the index and set that to index, save it. Okay, so seem to get rid of the console. So now if we click this, you'll see that our object here is changing. So we only have one object here of cat, now 2, 3. That's weird. It looks like it's like resetting. It's really odd. Go ahead and refresh this. And let's go ahead and just open this up into a new window. Make sure nothing weird is happening here. So let's see. So we get 1, 2, 3. So it looks like it's working here in the actual browser. This wasn't working in this preview. But you see now that we click this 10 times, we get all of these things that we need to then map over, and then we can use that to animate the bubbles. All right, so this is working as expected, even though it wasn't in this little preview. And now that actually, let's go ahead and open this up and just get rid of this little preview for now. Let's go view and go to appearance and toggle preview. All right, cool. So that gives us a little bit more room here to see what we're doing. And the next thing we want to do is we want to create the emoji bubble component. So again, in this emoji folder, create a new file called emoji bubble.jsx. And in here, let's go ahead and import styled. And we also want to import keyframes from style components as well, which is going to allow us to write keyframe animations in CSS. And that is going to come from styled components. Okay. Next up, we want to import the emoji wrapper, which we did at the very beginning of the video, which is going to make sure that our emojis are accessible. And that's going to be from the same folder, emoji wrapper. All right. Now, what we want to do here is then go ahead and define this emoji bubble. And this is going to be a styled emoji wrapper. Go ahead now and do the 2 backticks. We'll set position to absolute. We'll set the bottom to 0, so it starts all the way at the bottom of our page. And here we can go ahead and access those props that we passed in when we create the emoji. So if we go back into our board, remember when we click this, we set the size left 1 and 2. And once we map over these, we can pass these values that are in our state into our component. So that's where we're going to be using this here. So in order to access the props, we pass them in like this. And then we can use the props as we want. And we can call something like props.left. Now, again, we can destructure this. So let's go ahead and just access left right off of the props. And we need to wrap that around parentheses. And what we want to do here is just a little check. We want to say, let's see. So if left is available, we'll go ahead and use it. And if it's not, we'll set it to, let's do like 10. And then here we'll write the percentage here because we want this to be left of whatever percent. Next up, we want to set font size. And again, we can go ahead and destructure the values we need, which is just going to be the size. And we can say, hey, does size exist? If so, use it. And if not, we'll set it to 2. And the value here we're going to be using is rem. All right, next up is the animation. And for now, let's go ahead and define the animation above using this keyframes that we imported from styled components. So to do that, we first need to define the constant here. So that's going to be called float animation. We're passing in 2 variables here, one called 1, one called 2, which we're going to get access to from those props. And here we call keyframes and then 2 backticks. So very similar to the other styled components. And then we can just write our keyframes as we usually do. So 0%. So once at the very beginning of this, we want the bottom to be negative 10%. So it's going to push it down just so you can't see it. We'll set transform to translate x at 0. Okay. Next up, we want to do 50%. So halfway through the project, we want transform, translate x. Whoops. And here we can pass in that 1 value that we had here at the top of the function. So that's going to be 1. And the value we want this to be in is pixels. And the next one is going to be pretty similar. So let's just go ahead and copy this, paste it below. And at the end of this, so 100% of the animation, we want to set bottom. So let's go ahead and copy this one. Paste it here. We want it to be a little bit past the top. So in order to go past the top, once we define bottom, is just to pass it all the way to 100 plus, whatever percentage. So that's going to be 110%. So essentially this is just 10% above whatever is visible on the screen. And instead of the 1 variable, we want to pass in the 2 variable. All right, so now that we define this float animation, we can go ahead and define it down here and pass in the props as we need that we're going to get from our emoji bubble. So first off, we want to pass in and define this, this animation. So again, we can get access on the props we need, which is 1 and 2. And what this is going to do is we're going to pass it into that function that we just define. So float animation, passing in 1 and 2. Okay, so now that we have that defined, we can go ahead and define the size. So again, we do just structuring what we need, size. And what we want to do here is we want to compare the prop and to either change the duration. Now, I know we're using size here, but really what we're defining here in this animation CSS property is the duration of the animation. And what I was trying to accomplish here is that smaller emojis should move faster than bigger emojis. So what we can do is just use a ternary operator to say, hey, is the size less than 3? Then if it is, use 5 seconds. And if it's not, use 6 seconds. And we need to make sure that's in seconds. And last, we define the animation style. So that's going to be ease in and forwards. Now, what forwards is going to do is once the animation stops, it just ends. Now, if we did infinite, it would just keep going, but that's not the effect that we want to achieve here. All right, so I know that's a lot. Let's go ahead and save this. And last thing we need to do here is export default emoji bubble. All right, so we finished this finally. Let's go ahead and save this. And the next thing we want to do is head back into the emoji board, and we want to go ahead and render these out into the emoji board. So let's go back into our emoji board. And let's see, so right on this div, we have this. Let's go ahead and just render out a new div here. I think React is going to complain because we're not wrapping this entire project in a div, but that's okay. For now, we'll just go ahead and render out the state values. So just like we did for the emojis object, we'll do emoji queue dot map. We're getting access to each emoji object in here. And then with these, we can go ahead and render out what we need. So first we need to go ahead and import that emoji bubble that we just created. So we'll come up to all the way to the top, import emoji bubble from emoji bubble. Okay. Now we can actually use this in our render. So emoji bubble. And here is where we're going to define all the different props that we just defined in our styled components. Okay, so first one's going to be a key. If we don't define this, React's going to complain, and that's just going to be the emoji. Let's do, I don't think we have an emoji ID. Yeah, so it looks like what we can do is just like emoji. We can create a string here. So do emoji. Actually, we need to pass in an ID because our state's going to be changing so much. We need to make sure that each value has a separate ID. And what we can do is we can use a dependency here called, I think it's called short ID. Let's see here, short ID string generation, this one. All right, so once we did that, let's come to the top here, and we need to import this at the top above our local imports and do import, I think it's called generate from short ID. All right, so now that we have this imported, once we create these here in our handle emoji click and key down, we can pass another variable here called generate. And this is going to generate just a random string for us, which we can then use in our key. So let's go ahead and define that as well to our emoji key down. Go ahead and save that. Okay. Now in here, we can say emoji.id. Cool. So now we know that this key is going to be unique no matter how many emojis we're rendering to the screen. All right. So now we're going to do label, and that's going to be emoji label. You might have been thinking, hey, Hunter, can't we just destructure this so we don't have to write emoji every single time? And that's very true. So let's go ahead and define those here. So ID, label, symbol, size, left, 1 and 2. Okay. So let's go ahead and just do that so we don't have to write emoji 20 times. Then we can do symbol equals symbol. I'm just going to go ahead and speed through this because it's pretty straightforward. So we just go ahead and just speed this up a little bit. And it looks like we're getting some type of formatting error. So if that ever happens with map, it happens a lot sometimes when I'm doing map, just because it's confusing with the bracket syntax. So let's do emoji queue. And we'll ensure that this is right from the start. So map, we'll have everything we're destructuring. And let's see here. So one reason it's complaining is, so it looks like I need to wrap this into brackets. So everything here we need to destructure. Then that will pass in a function where we can render this out. Let's go ahead and copy these. So for whatever reason, I'm still getting some type of syntax error here. I'm just going to get rid of this div, see if that helps. All right, so it looked like I just had some like weird structuring going on there. I must have placed a div somewhere I didn't need to. Hopefully you didn't run into the same error, but it looks like things now should be fine. And let's go ahead now, see if I wrap this with a div, if it's going to complain. Okay, so looks like everything is good to go. And if we go back into our project and refresh this, we can now see that we're starting to get our animations working. Cool. So it looks like everything is working as expected, but if you're savvy, you've probably already thought about like what happens to these elements once they render on the screen. So let's go into our inspect, come into elements here so we can look at all the stuff in our project, come into our roots, class. All right, so once we click on this, you'll see here in this div, we're rendering out all these span elements. So these span elements are still in our DOM, even though they're not visible anymore. So the way we're going to handle that is with an auto expire React component, which is going to set a timeout to set the component to null after 6 seconds, because the longest these animations are 6 seconds. So after 6 seconds, we know that it's going to be finished, and we can just go ahead and remove it from the DOM altogether. Now, the way we can handle that is in our components folder, we can do a auto expire. And in this, it's actually a very simple component. What we need to do is import React from React. And we're going to be using a couple of things here from React. We're going to be importing fragment, useState, and useEffect. Okay. So now that we have that, let's go ahead and define the component here. So auto expire. We're going to be rendering children. So we'll just go ahead and pass and destructure that prop here. And here we want to go ahead and define a state to track whether it is or is not expired. So again, we'll define a variable like this. So is expired. And then set is expired. And the default value is going to be false. So it's not expired by when it first renders, which makes sense. And now we can use useEffect to track when 6 seconds is up and then change the state value. And we want to do this once the component renders. So we'll do useEffect, do our callback function, and remember the second param here is an array of arguments, and if it's empty, it means only run this once the component mounts. What we want to do is run a set timeout function. Going to set expired to true, and it's going to do that after 6 seconds. So the way we do that is in milliseconds, so 6,000 milliseconds. All right, so now that we have essentially the useEffect and state all handled, we need to now handle what is going to be rendered in the DOM. So we'll do if is expired. Well, what do we want to do if it's expired? We just want to return null. Else, if it's not expired, we want to return the children. Now, we could write this like this, but it's going to complain because we need to wrap this around something. So the way we can handle this in React is with a fragment. The fragment is like an empty wrapper, so it's not going to render anything to the HTML. It's essentially just going to make React happy. That, it's not going to give us any errors once we return this. And last, we want to export defaults, the name of our component. So auto expire. All right, so that's really the last thing we need to do here in this component. So let's come back into our emoji board. And around this emoji queue, or excuse me, the emoji bubble, we want to wrap the auto expire into this because the emoji bubble will be the child. Once that's rendered, it's going to set a timeout and then remove it from the DOM after 6 seconds. So let's do auto expire. And we'll put the emoji bubble in between here. Go ahead and save that. Now it's complaining because it doesn't know what auto expire is. So let's go make sure we import auto expire. And now everything, all the errors should be taken care of. Okay. And it looked like when I was looking at the original one, I don't need to wrap this with an extra div. So get rid of that div that I added. Let's come back to our React app. Let's go ahead and just refresh, make sure everything's good. Come back into our root app, into our div. And if we click here, you'll see down here that items are being added. But after 6 seconds, they should also be deleted. So make sure that works. Boom, everything's deleted. Our auto expire component works. All right, so that's everything for this project. I hope you had a lot of fun and learned a lot as well in the process. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and be sure to check out our other design and coding tutorials on skillthrive.com as well as our YouTube channel. Again, I'm Hunter from Skillthrive, and I'll see you in the next video.